After seeing all the forest shrines going around on the internet, I was really inspired to make my own. So here's this evil corrupted shrine, because it's a little bit too late. Made out of completely scrap materials from previous projects and failed prints. So the whole centerpiece is going to be this angel that didn't quite print to the resolution that I wanted. We're going to start out with a piece of MDF, and this is a piece from the giant modular theater build that is leftover scrap. I'm just coming through and marking out a roughly natural sort of shape that I'm going to carve out using a Stanley knife. These are really difficult to do, and it gets very sharp, so you got to be very careful. With that fully cut out, I've got these leftover tea lights that I used in a project a real long time ago. I'm just going to slot one in here. I cut this out using a circular hole saw. If you've ever made foam dungeon tiles, you probably have a lot of leftover scraps that just aren't the right size. I'm using a lot of my scraps here to build up the structure of this entire rocky formation, using hot glue to keep all of them down. Making sure to leave plenty of space for that little tea light to feed up inside. And because this spot is going to be enclosed, I hit it with some detailing with a little rock before I finally enclose the whole piece. To give the whole thing texture and give it a much more natural shape, I use a brass wire brush, I'm pretty sure it's brass, and just absolutely rip through all of the foam, really letting it kind of decide what shape it takes. I then score it a few times with the Stanley blade and continue on. This gives the brush a lot more cuts to catch onto and the little edges that the Stanley blade leaves. It makes the stone look a lot more distressed and natural looking. In some places, I just completely cut off a piece and come through again and refine that shape. This gives a great texture. It is really fun to do, but it leaves a lot of mess. So make sure I have a plastic bin bag or a vacuum cleaner on hand to catch all of those little scrap pieces. And with all of that texturing done, I then come in with a big rock and add in some really large textures. To fill in any gaps, I use the spackle filler and then wait for it to be just a little bit dry. This dries in about 30 minutes, so I give it about 15 minutes and I come through with a more plastic wire brush, and I add in those striations again. To add in a bit more detail, using that same foam, I cut some smaller rocks and add them to little spots around this bigger rock. And then to get rid of that just flat board look, I mix up a texture paste out of tea leaves, sand, dirt, and a bunch of PVA glue. And I spread this all around all of the exposed wood, and this will be the ground covering. I originally start using the brush, but I figure out that using my fingers is a lot easier. Once it is all dry, there are a couple of spots that are missing, so I just fill that up with some PVA glue and sprinkle on some loose sand. And I do the same to the top part of the biggest rock, because this will have some greenery growing up there. I then give it all a coat of black Mod Podge, just to make sure everything is sealed in, all the sand and all the loose, quite fine pieces of foam, and making sure not to cover up that little light in the little hovel that's been carved out. Whenever I use coffee stir sticks or popsicle sticks, I always keep all the offcuts. And now I'm using a bunch of these to texture up, and these will be the wooden planks of the little bridge going between the small rock and the big rock. Now to both paint and texture these, I'm going to mix together a brown and green wash. This is a very, very thick wash, and I add all of my sticks in as well as some extras. Mixing that through and letting it sit for a bit, and then pour it out onto a sheet of baking paper and wipe off all the excess. This will give it some curved and wet, sort of like bending in the wood, as well as texture and paint it. While I wait for those little bits to dry, I'm going to come in and paint all of this. I start with a very light sort of grey and cover absolutely everything, using a very watered down brush to get in all the nooks and crannies. To make the stone look a bit more natural and kind of magical as well, I mix together watered down green, browns, blues and yellows and just kind of dapple that all over the grey while it's still wet and drying. Once that's dry, to mute the colors a little bit, I mix in a brown and a black wash all over all of the stone. That dries a bit dark, so to bring back some of those bright highlights, I mix together a much brighter grey and absolutely dry brush all over all the stone pieces. And then, with the stone done, I cover all of the ground with a mixture of brown and green just to give some variety and variance. And I use a really watered down brush to get in all of the little nooks and crannies of that texture paste that we put down earlier. And then to utilize that texture to its extreme, I dry brush over with a much brighter creamy sort of color to catch all the highlights of the raised edges. I then go through fitting on all of the little wood pieces that I made before. By complete accident, this little hole kind of looks like a mine, so I'm going to make it the entrance to a mine shaft. And that's really easy because we don't even need to paint any of the wood. After it's dried, it's already textured up and looks really nice and natural. And then to a few toothpicks that I skewered in, I add on some rope, and this will be the little bridge that is broken to pieces. I'm going to take this rope and tie it around one of the planks and make it kind of look like it's being held on by the actual rope, and then use some super glue to hold that in place. As well as this, roll some rope down on the little ones at the bottom to look like it's been torn off or worn away. Then to add another level of playability, I use some toothpicks, I just skewer them in and add on these little platforms that would lead up to that original staircase, even though it's all worn away and gone to rust. Now for that little light in the back, I want to make it look like it's a really old campfire or something like that. So I take those pieces that would have been the rest of the staircase or the bridge, and I crack them up into little pieces like someone's come through, picked them up and broken them into pieces for their little fire. And then to add a little bit more detail, I make a little rope that's been tied up. Cover a piece of string in PVA glue, wrap that around a pencil and stick it in with some tacky glue. And it's these little details that make everything all the better. To make the Withered Old Tree, I use this technique I saw from Seb Makes Stuff, using a bunch of pipe cleaners and rolling them all around and then making the armatures like you would a normal tree with armature wire. But instead of adding leaves and bark on top of that, this already has the texture in it. However, we just have to bring the texture out. By slowly melting away all of the fuzz around it, we get a really nice, gnarly tree sort of texture. That looks really cool. I then use a really watered down burnt sienna and just cover all of the little cracks and details in there. Some of the black I miss, but that's alright, it just adds a little bit of shadow to the deepest crevices of this tree. And then I'll take that out and hot glue it all to the base. After painting the statue, real simple statue paint job, grey, brown and green, I then added a bunch of stones that I cut from a project ages ago. And then I'll use this as a little altar in front of the angel statue. To match the altar and kind of meld it all together, I just gave it a quick brush of a brown wash. And sporadically covered it with PVA glue, added some rocks, and sprinkled over some static grass. Before that PVA glue is completely dry and adding a little bit extra, I come through with some clump foliage and kind of spread it around in different pockets and areas where a lot of greenery would grow. And then adding some of those leftover flowers from that big theatre project I made a few weeks ago. I then used some beads to make some ancient rune stones, painted some runes out of this gold paint, and then also some bottles or urns of like offerings that were put up on the altar for the angel. And then I got this little pickaxe from a project a while ago. I just put that in the corner to add some more little details. And so the forest shrine is complete, with the angel of the altar petrified in stone and its own offerings up on the table. The broken bridge means it's difficult to get up there, but I'm sure you can find a way. And adventurers should heed that sign, for only danger lurks in those caverns. Despite the dangers, it looks like someone's taking up home inside of the rocky outcropping. It'd be good to stay warm near that fire. And of course, we can remove the statue, because any good statue should be able to come alive and attack